My stepmother said, "You'll never afford college," so I bought her house. The lock on the mailbox stuck the way it always stuck, and I stood there in the Ohio cold at exactly 4:42 in the afternoon, jiggling a key that had never once turned smoothly in 4 years, waiting for an envelope from a college that had already told me no in every way that mattered. "You'll never afford college. Not on what you make." She said it like she was reading me a weather report. Not cruel. Worse than cruel. Certain. I did not answer her. I never answered her right away. That was the one thing I had learned to do well in that house. Hold still until the sting passed, and then go somewhere quiet and do math in my head until the shaking stopped. By the time I got the mailbox open, my hands were not shaking anymore. They were just cold. In April. In a spring that had not decided yet whether it was going to be kind. Inside that envelope was a number that should have belonged to me. It did not say my name on the account, but it said my name in every memory I had of the last 3 years, every double shift, every Saturday I gave up, every time I told myself the word someday like it was a prayer instead of a plan. The paper was still warm from sitting in the metal box in the sun all afternoon. I remember that specifically because it felt strange for something to carry that much bad news and still be warm to the touch, like it hadn't gotten the memo about what it was about to do to me. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower was running, that flat mechanical drone that means nothing except that somebody's Tuesday is completely ordinary. Mine was not going to be ordinary anymore. I just did not know yet how not ordinary it was about to become. I had absolutely no idea, standing at that mailbox, how far this was about to go. I do not think Diane did either. If she had, I don't think she would have said it in front of the one person in that family who was quietly, carefully keeping receipts. My name is Maya Whitfield. I am 20 years old, and at the time all of this started, I was working 31 hours a week at a diagnostic imaging clinic on the east side of Columbus, checking patients in at a front desk with a laminated badge that said MAYA, Patient Services, taking 2 classes a semester at the community college because that was what fit around the schedule, and living in the house my father bought before I understood what a mortgage was. I want to tell you about my hands first, because that tells you more about me than my age does. By 20, my hands already knew things most 20-year-olds' hands do not know. They knew how to hold a blood pressure cuff steady on someone who was scared. They knew how to enter insurance codes fast enough that the line behind the counter never grew past 3 people. They knew how to fold a hospital gown the way patients liked corners in, so it did not feel like something torn off a shelf. I did not learn those hands from a classroom. I learned them because at 17, my mother got sick, and somebody had to learn how to talk to insurance companies at 7 in the morning before school, and it turned out to be me. That is the wound underneath everything else in this story, so I am going to tell it to you plainly instead of making you guess. My mother, Renee, died when I was 17. Not suddenly, slowly, in the particular cruel way that gives you 18 months to watch someone disappear one appointment at a time. I spent my junior year of high school learning the difference between an oncologist and a hospitalist, learning which nurses would actually call you back, learning how to sound older than I was on the phone, so people would take me seriously when I asked what a number on a bill actually meant. My father, Greg, worked construction. Framing crews, mostly. The kind of work where you come home with dust in the creases of your knuckles, no matter how long you scrub. He loved my mother in a way I only understood after she was gone. Quietly, constantly, in small physical gestures nobody had to ask him to make. He used to warm her socks on the heating vent in the winter before she put them on. Not a big gesture. Nobody would have written a song about it. But every night for the last 2 years of her life, before she asked, the socks were already warm. That is the kind of good this family used to have in it. I need you to know that, because it makes what came later hurt in a very particular way. I should tell you what our house sounded like before any of this, because you cannot understand what was taken without understanding what was there first. It sounded like my father's boots coming off by the back door at 5:40 every evening, 2 thumps, always 2, never 1 and never 3. It sounded like my mother, before she got sick, humming along badly to the radio while she did dishes, the same 3 songs on rotation for years, and none of us ever telling her how off-key she was because none of us wanted her to stop. It smelled, in the fall, like the particular mix of sawdust from my father's garage projects and cinnamon from whatever my mother was baking. 2 smells that should not have gone together and somehow always did. After she got sick, The house learned a new sound, the soft mechanical hum of a hospital-grade oxygen concentrator running in what used to be the guest room. A sound I got so used to that when it finally stopped, the silence itself felt like an intruder. I was 17. I remember the exact hour she died, 6:52 in the morning on a Wednesday in October, because I had just come downstairs to get ready for a shift at the clinic I had not yet officially started working at. And my father met me at the bottom of the stairs with a face that did not need words attached to it. I did not go to school that day, or for the rest of that week, and when I came back, I was not the same version of 17 that had left. I had learned, in the space of 18 months, how to speak to insurance adjusters like an adult, how to read an EOB statement for hidden denial codes, how to sit very still in a chair while someone told me something I did not want to hear and not let my face show what it was doing to me on the inside. Those are not skills most 17-year-olds have. I did not want them. I had them anyway, and 4 years later, when Diane sat across from me at a birthday dinner and folded up my college acceptance into one dismissive sentence about the house situation, some old, tired, competent part of me recognized the shape of what was happening before the rest of me caught up. I had learned to read a room that did not want to be read. I was about to need that skill again. 2 years after my mother died, my father married Diane. I want to be fair to Diane in the beginning of this, because that is how this actually happened. Not with a monster walking through the door, but with someone who, for the first 8 months, seemed like exactly what a grieving man and his grieving daughter needed. Diane was 51 when they married, worked as an office manager at a dental practice, dressed like she had somewhere important to be even on a Tuesday, and had a laugh that filled up a room in a way our house had not been filled in 2 years. She brought over a lasagna the second time she ever came to our house. She asked me questions about my mother and actually waited for the answers. At my mother's grave, 6 weeks into dating my father, she stood a respectful 10 feet back and let him have his moment alone, which is a small thing. But small things are how you learn whether someone is safe. For a while, I believed she was safe. The first signal, the one I dismissed, the one I now understand I should not have dismissed, came about 4 months into the marriage. My father had just closed on a small refinance on the house, mostly to consolidate some of the medical debt left over from my mother's treatment. Diane sat at our kitchen table that night going through the paperwork with him, and at one point, without looking up, she said, "It's smart to keep some things separate on paper. Just for organization." She said it so casually, so reasonably. I remember thinking, that's probably just how office managers talk. I did not know yet that for organization was going to become the phrase that explained almost everything. The second signal was smaller. She started referring to my college fund, the modest one my mother had set up years before with money from her own mother's estate, maybe $11,000, sitting in an account with my name and my father's name jointly on it, since I was a minor when it was opened, as the family education account. Not my account, the family's. I noticed it. I told myself I was being sensitive. Grief makes you sensitive in ways that are sometimes accurate and sometimes not. And at 17 and 18, I genuinely could not always tell which was which. The explicit moment, the one that could not be explained away, happened at my father's 52nd birthday dinner, 8 months before the mailbox afternoon. I had just gotten my acceptance into a 4-year nursing program. Not the community college anymore, the real thing, the thing I had built my whole schedule and my whole life around getting to. I said it out loud at the table, hopeful in a way I rarely let myself be anymore. My father's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Pride, plain and unguarded, the kind he had not worn since before my mother got sick. Diane smiled too, and then she said, to the table, not even really to me, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. We'll have to see what makes sense financially. Programs like that add up fast, and with the house situation, we have to be realistic." The house situation. I did not know yet what that meant. I only knew that I had watched my father's pride get quietly folded up and put away in the space of one sentence, the way you fold a good shirt you are not allowed to wear tonight. I did not react. I have never been a person who reacts in the moment. I said thank you, I ate my cake, and I went home and lay on my bed with the acceptance letter on my chest like a piece of armor, and I decided quietly that I was going to find out exactly what the house situation meant. I want to back up, though, because there were smaller moments before that birthday dinner that I did not understand as signals until much later, and I think it is worth walking through them in order, The way I eventually had to walk through them out loud with Carol, because that is how you catch someone who is careful, not with one big mistake, but with a pattern of small ones that only make sense once you line them up side by side. There was the time, about 5 months into the marriage, when Diane reorganized the kitchen without asking anyone, and in the process, quietly boxed up 3 of my mother's mixing bowls, not thrown away, just moved to the garage, to make room. I found them a week later stacked next to the paint cans and did not say anything because it felt petty to make an issue out of mixing bowls, and because Diane, when I mentioned it lightly, said all the right things. "Oh, I didn't realize those meant something. Let's absolutely bring them back in." And did, in fact, bring them back in that same afternoon. It would have been easy to file that under misunderstanding. I filed it there myself, for a long time. There was the way she talked about money in front of my father, always in a tone that sounded like partnership and never quite was. "We should think about," she'd say, and then whatever followed was always something that ended up benefiting the household in ways that traced back, eventually, to her own financial position, a new car for her commute, a kitchen renovation she'd wanted before she ever met my father, a family emergency fund that, I would later learn, she alone had signing authority over. Each individual request sounded reasonable. It was only in hindsight, laid end to end, that they looked like a slow current pulling everything toward one direction. And there was her phone. I do not think I am imagining this, though I want to be honest that I cannot prove it the way I proved everything else in this story. She kept it face down on every surface, every single time, in a house where nobody else did that, where my father left his phone face up on the charger every night without a second thought. I noticed it. I dismissed it, the way you dismiss a lot of things when you are trying very hard to believe your home is safe again after spending 18 months learning it might not always be. None of those things, alone, would have been enough to build a case out of. Together, they were the outline of a person who had been managing us, carefully, patiently, one small reasonable request at a time, long before the sentence about college ever left her mouth. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that actually explains everything that came after, and I did not stumble into it. I built toward it, on purpose, over 4 months, the way you build anything that has to hold weight. It started with a folder, not a metaphorical one, an actual manila folder, the kind my father kept his tax paperwork in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in what used to be my mother's sewing room and was now officially Diane's office. I was not snooping. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in a story like this. I went into that room on a Tuesday afternoon in November to find the space heater, because my father had asked me to grab it for the garage where he was working on a shelving unit. The filing cabinet drawer was open 2 inches, just enough that when I reached past it for the heater cord, a folder edge caught my sleeve and slid halfway out onto the floor. I picked it up to put it back. That is when I saw the label in Diane's handwriting on the tab, REFI, Education Fund Transfer. I did not read it that day. I put it back exactly where it had been, heater cord and all, and I went outside and helped my father with the shelving unit and said nothing, because something in my chest had gone very still and very quiet, the way water goes still right before it starts to move. That night I could not sleep, not from anger, not yet, from the specific, cold clarity of understanding that there was a document with my name in a folder in my dead mother's sewing room that I was not supposed to see, and that not being supposed to see it was, itself, the whole answer. 3 days later, on a Friday when Diane had a dental conference in Cincinnati and my father was pulling a double shift on a framing job 40 minutes out of town, I went back into that room. I want to describe the room the way it actually was, because it matters. It still smelled faintly like the lavender drawer sachets my mother used to keep in there, underneath the newer smell of Diane's printer toner and the vanilla candle she burned on the windowsill. 2 ghosts sharing one room. The afternoon light came in low and yellow through the blinds, cutting the carpet into stripes. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at nothing. Over and over, the sound of an ordinary Friday that had no idea what was happening inside our house. The folder was exactly where it had been. My hands were steady when I opened it, steadier than they had any right to be, and then they were not steady at all. Inside were 4 documents, a refinance application from 14 months earlier, listing my father as the sole borrower, with Diane's handwriting in the margin next to the equity line. Confirm with Greg, access before Maya turns 21. Timing matters. A printed email chain between Diane and a financial advisor named Curtis Feld, dated 6 months back, subject line education account restructuring, in which Diane had written, and I am going to tell you this the way I remember it because I read it enough times that it is burned into me. Greg won't push back if I frame it as protecting the house. He feels guilty about Renee's medical debt and will agree to almost anything that sounds responsible. The girl doesn't need to know the account was ever separate. By the time she's old enough to ask real questions, it'll already be folded into the home equity, and there won't be anything to argue about. The girl. Not Maya. The girl. I read that sentence enough times that I could have recited it in my sleep. The girl doesn't need to know. I am going to tell you something honest. I have thought about that phrase almost every day since, and it still does something specific and physical to me every single time. A kind of coldness that starts at the back of my neck and goes down through my shoulders. Not because it was mean. Because it was efficient. She had not written it in anger. She had written it the way you write a project plan. I was a line item to be managed around. I sat down on the floor of that sewing room, right there on the carpet with its faint stripes of afternoon light, because my legs did not feel entirely reliable anymore, and I read the whole email chain again from the top, slower this time, looking for anything that might soften what I had already understood on the first read. It did not soften. If anything, the second read was worse, because the second time through I noticed the small things, the casual way Curtis Feld had responded. Understood, I'll structure the paperwork accordingly, like this was a routine Tuesday request, and not a plan to erase a dead woman's last gift to her daughter. I noticed that Diane had signed off the email with a smiley face. A small yellow smiley face, at the bottom of a message about erasing me from an account with my name on it. I want to describe what my body did in that room, because style matters less to me here than honesty does. My hands went cold, the way Carol later told me hands do when the nervous system decides something is a threat before the rest of you has caught up to why. Not shaking, cold, and very still, like they belonged to someone else, and I was simply borrowing them for the afternoon. My hearing did something strange too. The dog outside kept barking, and it seemed to get both louder and further away at the same time, like sound traveling through water. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even as I was having the thought, that I needed to remember every single detail of this room exactly as it was right now, because I was never again going to be able to walk into it without knowing what I now knew, and some part of me wanted to be able to describe, later, to someone, exactly what that last moment of not officially knowing had looked like. Then, the way you do when your body finishes its own private earthquake and your mind finally catches up and takes over, I felt something specific and unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not panic, which I had expected, but a strange, heavy stillness, like furniture being carried into a room I had not agreed to have furnished. I sat with it for maybe 90 seconds. Then I picked up my phone, and I started photographing. The fourth document was the one that actually took my breath. A signature page from the $11,000 education account, dated 4 months earlier, transferring the funds into a joint home equity line under both my father's and Diane's names. My name was gone from the account entirely, and at the bottom, next to my father's real signature, was a second signature that was supposed to be mine. It was not my handwriting. I have signed my name enough times on hospital consent forms and insurance paperwork to know exactly what my signature looks like under pressure, in a hurry, tired, distracted. That was not it. The M was rounded in a way I never round it. The loop on the Y went the wrong direction. Somebody had signed my name to give away the last piece of money my mother left me. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect crying and I did not do it, not then. What happened instead was that everything got very slow and very quiet, the way it gets right before a car accident, that strange stretched-out second where your body already knows something your mind is still catching up to. I could hear the dog barking outside. I could hear the refrigerator humming down the hall. I could hear my own heartbeat, which felt like it was arriving about half a second late to everything, like a song playing through a bad speaker. I photographed all 4 documents with my phone at exactly 3:56 in the afternoon on a Friday in November, put the folder back precisely as I had found it, closed the drawer to the exact 2 inches it had been open, and walked out of that room like I had never been in it. Then I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before I could make my hands work well enough to drive. I did not confront anyone that day. I did not confront anyone that week. I want you to understand that this was not weakness, and it was not fear, although I felt both of those things plenty. It was a decision, made in that car in the driveway, that if I went inside and said what I knew, Diane would have 4 months to explain it away, hide the rest, and turn my father against believing me before I ever got the chance to prove it. She was smarter than that email made her sound reckless. The email was reckless. She was not. I needed more than one document. I needed something nobody could talk their way around. The first person I told was my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, a woman who had spent 31 years as a paralegal at a family law firm downtown before she semi-retired to do consulting work 3 days a week. I drove to her house that Sunday and sat at her kitchen table and showed her the photos on my phone without saying a word first, because I did not trust my own voice yet to explain it in order. Carol read all 4 documents twice. Then she set the phone down very carefully, like it was something that might go off, and she said the sentence that ended up rearranging how I understood the entire situation. Maya, listen to me. This isn't a misunderstanding, and it isn't even really about the money, not primarily. Forging a minor's signature, or an adult child's signature, on a financial transfer document is fraud. It doesn't matter that it's family. Fraud doesn't have a family discount. She tapped the screen on the second signature. This right here is the only piece of this whole thing that a court cares about. Everything else is a story. This is evidence. I asked her what I should do. You do not confront her, Carol said, immediately, without a beat of hesitation. The second you confront her, she has time to build a defense, get your father on her side of the story, maybe even fix the signature situation before anyone official ever sees it. You are 20 years old, and she thinks you are still 17 in every way that matters. She thinks you're too young, too grateful, too grief-soft to ever push back. That is her mistake, and you should let her keep making it for exactly as long as it takes you to be unshakable. That was the sentence, the one I would come back to over and over in the months that followed. She thinks you're grief-soft. That is her mistake. Let her keep making it. Carol said one other thing that day at her kitchen table that I have carried with me every day since, long after the case itself was finished. She had seen a version of this before, professionally, more times than she could count in 31 years. Not always with step-parents, sometimes with adult children, sometimes with business partners, but always with the same underlying shape. People who do this kind of thing, she said, stirring sugar into coffee she had made and then let go cold, count on 2 things happening at once. They count on the person they're taking from being too grateful, or too grief-stricken, or too young to check. And they count on time, on enough months passing that by the time anyone does check, it feels too late, too messy, too painful to unravel. What you have going for you, Maya, that most people in your position don't have, is that you found this early enough, and you were stubborn enough, to refuse both of those bets. She looked at me directly then, over the rim of her cold coffee. At 20, forged paperwork looks like a technicality to people who don't understand what a signature actually protects. At 20, if you build this case right, it isn't a technicality, it's the whole ballgame. Carol connected me, that same week, with a forensic document examiner she had worked with on 3 prior cases, a woman named Patricia Ostrowski who worked out of a modest office above a dry cleaner in Westerville and who, when I brought her copies of my real signature from a stack of old insurance forms alongside the photographed forgery, spent 40 minutes with a loop and a light box before she said, "This is not a close call. Whoever did this was in a hurry and was not particularly skilled. I can write you a report that would hold up." I paid her $400 for that report out of money I had been saving, quietly, in an account Diane did not know existed, under a name that was not obviously mine, because by then I had already stopped trusting any space in that house that was not locked. That last detail matters, so let me back up and explain it. 6 weeks before I found the folder, without knowing yet what I was preparing for, I had opened a second bank account at a credit union across town, not the bank my father and Diane used, and started quietly moving small amounts from my paycheck into it. 20 here, 40 there, nothing that would show up as a pattern on a joint statement, because I was not on any joint statement to begin with. I told myself it was for emergencies. Some part of me, the part that had learned to read a room in an oncology waiting room at 17, already knew what kind of emergency it was going to be. I need to tell you about the 4 months between finding that folder and the mailbox afternoon, because those months are the part of the story that actually cost me the most, and the part most people skip when they imagine what getting even looks like. It does not look like a montage. It looks like sitting across the dinner table from someone who forged your signature and passing the salt. I ate dinner with Diane 40-some times during that stretch. I asked her about her day. I laughed, genuinely, at a story she told about a difficult patient at the dental office, because the story actually was funny, and grief and betrayal do not cancel out a sense of humor, they just sit uncomfortably next to it. I watched her hang a new set of curtains in the living room, curtains that, I would later understand, she had paid for partly with equity drawn from the same account that used to be mine, and I told her they looked nice because they did, and because saying so cost me nothing and bought me 4 more months of her believing I had no idea. My father, in those months, kept saying variations of the same thing. I know this house situation has been stressful, kiddo. Once things settle, we'll figure out school. I would nod. I never once told him what I had found. That was the hardest restraint of the entire story, harder than anything that came later, because I loved him, and I knew that whatever I was about to do was going to break something in him too. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because loving someone who does something wrong to you does not stop your body from grieving them a little when the truth comes out. I worked my 31 hours a week. I went to my 2 community college classes. I kept building the case. I got copies of the original education account statements from before the transfer, pulled through the credit union that had originally held them, using my legal right of access as the named beneficiary. A right that, notably, Diane's restructuring had apparently forgotten still technically existed in the paper trail, even after the funds themselves were moved. I got a certified copy of the refinance application. I got, through a records request Carol helped me file, the notarization log for the signature page, because a genuine notarization requires the signer to appear in person, and I had photographic proof, from my work time card for that exact date and hour, that I had been checking in patients at a diagnostic imaging clinic 14 miles away at the precise time the notary's log claimed I had appeared in his office. That time card turned out to be the single most devastating piece of evidence in the entire case, and I did not even go looking for it. It just existed, quietly, because I had been at work, being reliable, being exactly the kind of person who shows up, while someone else was signing my name to give away what my mother left me. I found a family law attorney, a woman named Renata Cho, whose fee I paid in installments out of the credit union account, $40 and $60 at a time, the same way I had built that account in the first place. And by the 3rd week of March, 6 weeks before the mailbox afternoon, Renata told me something that changed the shape of everything that followed. Maya, based on what you've assembled here, you don't just have a fraud claim. You have leverage most people in your position never get. Your father's name is the sole name on the refinance itself. Diane is not on the mortgage. Which means legally, this house belongs to your father alone. Which means if he ever chose to sell it, Diane would have no legal claim to the proceeds beyond whatever the courts decide she's owed for contributions during the marriage. And forged financial fraud committed against a stepchild is not exactly a strong position from which to argue you deserve half a house. I want to tell you about the specific texture of those 6 weeks because gathering evidence sounds clean and organized when you say it out loud, and it was not clean, and it was not always organized. It was a Tuesday afternoon spent on hold with the records department for 51 minutes because I did not want to make the call from my own phone number in case caller ID ever became something Diane thought to check. It was learning, from a stranger at the credit union's records desk, how to phrase a beneficiary access request so it would not trigger an automatic notification to the joint account holders, a small technical detail that mattered more than almost anything else in the entire process, because one careless request could have ended everything 4 months early. It was driving to Patricia Ostrowski's office above the dry cleaner twice, once to drop off the samples, and once to pick up the report, and sitting in my car outside both times, just breathing, before I felt steady enough to go back to a house where I had to eat dinner across the table from the person I was building a case against. There was a particular Wednesday in February I still think about. I had picked up the notarization log that morning, the piece of evidence that would eventually matter more than almost anything else, and I came home that afternoon to find Diane in the kitchen, humming, making a pot of the same chili she made every February for what she called soup season, and she handed me a bowl without me asking, the way she always did, and said, extra hot sauce, just how you like it. And I took the bowl and said thank you and sat at the table and ate chili made by a woman whose forged version of my signature was, at that exact moment, folded inside a manila envelope in the trunk of my car. That is the part of the story nobody tells you about revenge, or justice, or whatever you want to call what I eventually did. Most of it is not dramatic. Most of it is eating chili and being handed hot sauce and saying thank you, while a completely different version of the truth sits 11 feet away in a parked car. Then I asked Renata the question that had actually been sitting underneath everything I had built for 4 months. What if I bought it? Renata looked at me for a second like she was recalculating something. The house. If my dad ever wanted to sell, if this all came out and he wanted out of the marriage, out of that equity mess she created, could I be the one who buys it? Not to live in it forever. To make sure it's never hers. To make sure the last thing she does in that house is watch someone she called the girl hand her a check with my name on it. Renata was quiet for a second, and then she said something I have never forgotten. That's not revenge, Maya. That's architecture. Let's build it right. I am not going to pretend the money for a house appeared out of nowhere, because if I told you that, you would rightly stop believing anything else in this story, and everything else in this story is true. So let me tell you exactly how a 20-year-old with a part-time front desk job ends up in a position to buy a house, because the answer is not glamorous. It is math, and it is grief, and it is one piece of very good luck that I did not create and will never pretend I did. The $11,000 that had been stolen from the education account was never fully recovered as cash. Renata's advice was to pursue it as leverage in the eventual settlement, not chase it as a standalone recovery, because chasing it alone would have tipped my hand too early. But separate from that account, entirely separate, there was something I had not thought much about until Carol brought it up that Sunday at her kitchen table. My mother's mother, my grandmother, who died when I was 11, had left a small life insurance policy and a modest life savings split between my mother and Aunt Carol. When my mother died, her portion of that inheritance passed to me, held in a restricted trust until I turned 21, managed by a trustee neither Diane nor my father had ever had access to, because my mother, in one of the last clear-headed decisions she made before the last stretch of her illness, had set it up that way on purpose, with Carol as co-trustee, specifically. Carol told me this the same day at the kitchen table, her voice going thin in a way I had never heard from her. Because your mother told me, near the end, that she didn't fully trust how things might go for you if she wasn't here to watch. My mother had not known Diane. My mother had died before Diane ever existed in our lives. But my mother had known grief, and she had known what grief sometimes does to the people left holding it, and she had protected me from a danger she could not have named, for years before it had a name. Carol told me one more detail that day, almost as an afterthought, that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this entire story. When my mother set up that trust, restricted until my 21st birthday, my father had gently pushed back at the time, thinking it seemed excessive. Renee, it's Maya. She's not going to need protecting from her own family. And my mother had said only, I'm not protecting her from the family I know. I'm protecting her from whatever family might come next, if I'm not here to meet them first. She had said it kindly, Carol told me, not suspicious of anyone in particular, just careful in the specific way that people become when they know they are running out of time to be careful in person. She never got to meet Diane. She built a wall around a piece of my life anyway, 4 years in advance, for a threat she could only imagine in the abstract. I think about that a great deal. I think it might be the last, best thing she ever did for me, and she did it without ever knowing my stepmother's name. That trust held just under $130,000. I did not have full access to it yet at 20. The terms required either my 21st birthday, which was 5 months away, or a court-approved early release for a significant, documented purpose, which Carol, half laughing and half in disbelief at her own idea, pointed out that purchasing a primary residence, particularly one connected to demonstrable fraud committed against the beneficiary, is about as textbook a significant documented purpose as I have ever heard of in 20 years of practice. It took Renata 6 weeks of paperwork, one hearing in front of a probate judge who read my forensic document report, my time card, the notarization log, and the email between Diane and Curtis filled with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. A slow, flat, professional anger that made me feel, for the first time in the entire process, like the adults in the room finally understood what I had been carrying alone, and one signature from that same judge to release the funds early. I did not go to my father with any of this yet. Not the trust, not the forgery, not the 6 weeks of court paperwork. I want you to sit with that, because I know it sounds cold, and I promise you it did not feel cold from the inside. It felt like holding my breath underwater for as long as I possibly could, because I knew that the second I surfaced, I was going to have to watch my father's face understand what his wife had done, and there was no version of that moment that was not going to hurt him. I chose, instead, to let the mailbox afternoon happen exactly the way it was always going to happen. I let Diane say, "You'll never afford college," one more time, in April, at that mailbox, in front of a neighbor who happened to be walking her dog and later told me, with the particular satisfaction of someone who never liked Diane much anyway, that she had heard the whole thing. I let it happen because by then, I already had the trust release order sitting in a folder in my car, and I already knew, with a certainty that felt less like anger and more like gravity, exactly what I was going to do with it. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen the way I used to imagine it would when I was angrier and less patient, back in December, back before Carol taught me the difference between a reaction and a plan. It happened at a family dinner in early May, my father's idea, not mine, a clear the air dinner he had been wanting to have for weeks because he could feel, correctly, that something between Diane and me had gone cold and formal in a way that worried him. He picked the restaurant, a steakhouse downtown that Diane liked, white tablecloths, the kind of place where she felt, I think, most fully like the woman she wanted people to see her as. I brought a folder, a physical one, the same size and shape, almost deliberately, as the one I had found in my mother's sewing room 7 months earlier. The restaurant was the kind of place with heavy cloth napkins, and a wine list nobody at our table was going to open, low gold lighting that made everyone look a little softer than they were, and a pianist somewhere near the bar playing something slow and forgettable that nobody in the room was actually listening to. Diane had chosen a table near the window, the good table, the one she always requested, the one that let her be seen by anyone walking past on the sidewalk outside. I remember thinking, sitting down, that she had picked her favorite room to feel safe in, on the exact night she was about to stop feeling safe in any room for a very long time, and there was something almost sad about that, watching her smooth her napkin into her lap with the same careful satisfaction she always had in that seat. We ordered. We made small talk. My father, visibly relieved that the table felt warmer than it had in weeks, told a story about a job site, a foreman who'd nearly walked into wet concrete checking his phone, a story he told before, one that always made Diane laugh in the exact same place, right on cue, and it did again that night, one last time before anything changed. I let it run for almost 20 minutes before I set the folder on the table, unopened, next to my water glass. "Dad," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "Before we get our food, there's something I need everyone at this table to see." I want to describe what happened next slowly, because it happened slowly, in a way that felt, in the moment, like time had thickened around us. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the tablecloth to my father, the forensic examiner's report, the side-by-side comparison of my real signature against the one on the transfer document. He picked it up. I watched his eyes move across it twice before his face changed. "That's not my signature," I said quietly. "It was made to look like mine on the document that moved my education fund into the home equity line. I have a certified copy of my work time card for the exact hour that document claims I appeared in person before a notary. I was 14 miles away, checking in patients at my job. I have that time card here, too." Diane's face, in that first moment, did something I had genuinely not predicted, and it is the moment style rule tells every writer to look for, and I want to be honest that I did see it, even in the middle of everything else. A flicker, brief, almost involuntary, of something that looked less like calculation and more like a woman watching a version of herself she had convinced herself she'd never have to see reflected back at her. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by something much more familiar. "This is completely out of context," Diane said, her voice climbing slightly, reaching for the document like she could take it out of my father's hands. "There was paperwork moving quickly during the refinance. Things get signed by different people sometimes to keep the process on schedule. This happens constantly in real estate. Ask anyone. There's more, I said, and slid the second document across, the printed email chain with Curtis Feld. I watched my father's eyes find the line. The girl doesn't need to know. I watched something in his shoulders drop, physically drop, an inch, like a weight had been set down on them that had not been there a second before. Diane's second stage arrived faster than her first had ended. Greg, honey, look at me. This is being read completely wrong. I was protecting the house for all of us. For our future, I never meant. You wrote that I don't need to know, I said. I kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping it even, alone in my car, more times than I want to admit. Not that you'd tell me later. Not that you'd explain it to me when I was older. That I don't need to know at all. That was the plan. Fold it in before I'm old enough to ask real questions. Those are your words, not mine. My father set the two documents down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter, and for a long moment he did not say anything at all. Then he looked at Diane and asked one question, quiet, almost gentle, in a voice that broke my heart more than anything else that night. Is this true? And Diane, in the third stage, the one Carol had warned me to watch for, made the mistake that ended everything. She did not deny it outright anymore. She could not with the time card sitting there, not with her own handwriting on the notary log margin. Instead, she pivoted, sharp and fast, toward my father directly, away from me entirely, like I had already stopped being a person in the room. Greg, you have to understand the position I was in. Your medical debt from Renee was crushing us. I was trying to protect what we'd built. She's 20 years old. She doesn't need $100,000 sitting around. She needs structure. She has $130,000, I said quietly, from a trust my mother set up before she died, that you never knew existed, because my mother didn't trust the situation you were going to become before you ever walked through her door. The table went completely silent. I could hear, somewhere behind us, a server setting down plates at another table, the small clatter of silverware, someone's laugh 2 booths over, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday night continuing on without any idea what had just happened 4 feet away. Diane tried one more pivot, and it is the moment I think about most when people ask me how I stayed calm through the whole thing, because it is also the moment I came closest to not staying calm. She looked at me, not my father, and her voice dropped into something softer, more wounded, more practiced. Maya, honey, I know you've had a hard few years. I know losing your mom did something to how you see people trying to help you. Have you thought about whether you might be misreading some of this out of grief? I want to be honest that this was the most dangerous thing she said all night. More dangerous than any denial, because it was aimed exactly at the place she knew I was softest, the possibility that my own grief had made me an unreliable narrator of my own life. For one full second, sitting there, I felt the old, familiar pull of doubting myself instead of her. I had felt that pull 100 times over the last 4 years, every time a doctor dismissed a question, every time an insurance rep implied I did not understand my own mother's diagnosis. It is a very old, very effective move, and I understood, watching her deploy it, that she had probably used some version of it before, on other people in other rooms, and it had probably worked. It did not work that night, because I had a forensic document examiner's signed report, a time card, and a notarization log sitting on the table in front of both of us, and grief, however real mine was, does not forge signatures. I said exactly that, quietly, and I watched something in her face understand, for the first time all evening, that the softer approach was not going to land either. That was when the authority figure entered the story, though not in the way you might picture it. Not a lawyer walking dramatically into a steakhouse. Renata had, 3 days earlier at my request, sent a formal notice letter to my father's home address outlining the fraud claim and the trust documentation, timed to arrive the same week as this dinner, specifically so that if the conversation at the table went sideways, my father would already have independent, professional confirmation waiting for him at home, not just my word against Diane's in the heat of an argument. My father mentioned this letter, quietly, near the end of the meal, that he had in fact already opened it 2 nights before, already read every page, and had spent 2 sleepless nights deciding how to bring it up himself, before I ever set the folder down on the tablecloth. That detail rearranged something in me when I heard it. My father had already known on his own for 2 days. He had not confronted Diane either. He had been carrying it too, quietly, the same way I had been carrying it for 4 months, both of us circling the same painful truth from different directions, each of us trying to protect the other from having to hear it first. And I used part of it, I said, to release a probate court order 6 weeks ago. Dad, the house is in your name only. It always has been. She was never on the mortgage. Which means when you decide what you want to do about this marriage, that decision is entirely yours to make and hers to accept. I turned to Diane for the first time directly, and I want to tell you the truth about what I felt in that moment, because it was not triumph, not exactly, though there was some of that in it. Mostly what I felt was very tired and very clear, the way you feel after you have been holding your breath for a very long time and finally get to let it out. If my father chooses to sell that house, I said, I have a pre-approval letter from my attorney and a lender ready to close within 30 days. I would like to be the buyer, not because I want to live in it forever. I want to be the person who signs the closing paperwork with my real signature in front of a real notary on the exact property where someone forged my name to steal from me. I want to tell you honestly that the rest of that dinner did not end with anyone raising their voice, because that is not what happened. And I promised myself when I started telling the story that I would not exaggerate it into something louder than it actually was. Diane cried, quietly, into a cloth napkin, and my father did not go to comfort her, and that not going was its own kind of verdict that did not need a judge to deliver it. An attorney was, in fact, already partly involved, not dramatically appearing at the restaurant the way it happens in some versions of these stories, but present in the sense that mattered. Renata had prepared, in advance, a formal notice of the fraud claim along with the trust release documentation, which my father's own attorney reviewed within the week and confirmed, point by point, matched everything Diane could not deny. My father filed for divorce 11 days later, not out of cruelty, out of something closer to grief. A second grief, different from my mother's, the grief of realizing the person you rebuilt your life with had, at some point along the way, started treating your daughter as an obstacle to manage rather than a person to protect. I sat in my car outside the courthouse the day the paperwork was filed, not celebrating, not triumphant, just still. I remember the exact time, 11:14 in the morning, because I looked at the dashboard clock and thought, absurdly, that it felt like it should be later, like a day this heavy should not fit inside a Tuesday morning. I felt something I had not expected to feel, sitting there. Not just relief. Grief. Actually, real grief, for the version of Diane who had brought over a lasagna and waited 10 feet back at my mother's grave and asked real questions about who my mother had been. I do not think that version of her was entirely fake. I think it was real, and I think somewhere along the way, fear about money and a house and a future she was scared of losing had eaten most of it. That does not excuse what she did. It just makes the whole thing sadder than a simple villain would have been. I want to tell you about the drive home from that restaurant, because it is one of the few parts of the story that still surprises me every time I remember it. My father drove. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then, at a red light on Route 33, without looking at me, he said, "I keep thinking about the socks." I asked him what he meant. "Your mother's socks. I used to warm them on the vent before she asked. I stopped doing anything like that for anyone the last 2 years. I think some part of me knew, before tonight, that I'd stopped doing the kind of paying attention that keeps you from missing something like this." The light turned green. He did not move for a second, and the car behind us tapped its horn once, gently, and he pulled forward like he was returning from somewhere far away. "I'm sorry, Maya. I should have been the one who caught this. Not you." I told him what I actually believed, which was that it was never his job to catch it, because he had not been the one going through that filing cabinet, and because grief does something to a person's attention that is not a character flaw, it is just physics. You cannot watch everything when part of you is still watching for someone who is gone. He did not say anything else for the rest of the drive, but he reached over at one point and squeezed my hand at another red light, the same way he used to when I was small enough to need help crossing a parking lot, and something in that small gesture undid me more than the entire dinner had. The house sold 4 months later. My father, once the divorce settlement finalized, Diane received a modest cash settlement reflecting her contributions during the marriage, considerably less than she would have received without the fraud finding weighing against her position, and considerably less than she had clearly hoped a home equity restructuring would eventually secure her, decided he did not want to stay in it either. Too many rooms that used to smell like my mother's lavender sachets, and now smelled like an ending he had not chosen for himself. I bought it. Closing was on a Thursday in September, at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, in a title office with fluorescent lights and a coffee machine that smelled slightly burnt. I signed my name 11 separate times across that closing packet, and every single time, the notary compared it to my ID without a flicker of doubt, because it was mine, because there was never anything wrong with my signature to begin with. The only thing that had ever been wrong was who had been allowed to use it. I did not move in and live there triumphantly, the way I think some version of 18-year-old me might have imagined doing, back before I understood how complicated all of this would actually feel. I rented it out within 2 months, to a young family, a nurse and her husband and their toddler, and I used the rental income, along with what remained of the trust, to do exactly what I had spent 4 years trying to do before any of this started. I enrolled, that January, in the 4-year nursing program I had gotten into the year before, the one Diane had once said we'd have to see about financially. I heard about Diane secondhand, the way you do with people who exit your life through a courtroom instead of a conversation. She moved into an apartment complex near the dental office where she still worked, the same job, the same laugh in the break room. According to a co-worker of hers, Carol happened to know from a different case entirely. I do not know if she ever talks about what happened. I do not know if she tells a version of a story where she is the one who was wronged, where a bitter stepdaughter with a chip on her shoulder blew a simple financial misunderstanding into a fraud accusation. People often do build that version for themselves because it is easier to live inside than the truth. I do not spend much time wondering about it. Wondering about her, I have found, takes up space I would rather spend on my own life. 1 year later, my life looks smaller and quieter than the version of it in this story, in the way that real life usually does after the dramatic part is over, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give it. I live in a modest 1-bedroom apartment near campus, 10 minutes from the imaging clinic where I still work 16 hours a week on weekends. My father and I have Sunday dinner together most weeks, just the two of us now, and he has started, slowly, warming up socks on the heating vent again. Not for anyone in particular, he told me once, a little embarrassed, just because it turns out it was never really about her. It was about being the kind of person who does small, warm things for people he loves. I still own the house. My tenants planted tomatoes in the backyard this past spring, in the same patch of dirt where my mother used to grow them, and when I stopped by in June to fix a leaking faucet, the smell of tomato plants in the June heat hit me so hard I had to sit on the back step for a minute before I could finish the job. I have a small daily joy now that I did not have during any of the 4 months I spent building a case against someone who once shared my dinner table. Every morning before my first class, I make 1 cup of coffee, slowly, standing at my own small kitchen counter in my own small apartment, and I drink it looking out a window that belongs to nobody but me. It is not dramatic. It is just mine, in a way that nothing in that house, for a long time, ever quite was. My relationship with Carol has changed too, in a way I did not expect going into any of this. She was always family, technically, but there was a formality to it before. Holiday visits, the occasional phone call, the kind of aunt-niece relationship that exists mostly around obligation. Now she calls me most Sunday evenings, not about anything urgent, just to talk, and twice this past spring she drove the 40 minutes to sit with me at the rental house while I did small repairs, handing me tools like she'd done it 100 times before, telling me stories about my mother as a teenager that I had never heard, stories that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with who I come from. I think some part of both of us needed to prove, to each other, that the family that survived this was still a real family, not just a group of people who had successfully won a legal argument together. My father remarried no one, not yet, and when I asked him once, gently, whether he thought he ever would, he said something that surprised me with how much peace was in it. I'm not in a hurry anymore. I spent 2 years after your mother rushing toward not being alone, and I think that's part of how I ended up missing what I missed. I'd rather take my time and actually see someone clearly than be warm again quickly. He still warms socks on the vent, he told me, laughing at himself a little. Just his own now. He says it's become less about anyone else and more about being the kind of man who still does small kind things, even when nobody's there to receive them. I finished my first full year of the nursing program in May, with a schedule that no longer requires me to choose between rent, money, and homework, for the first time since I was 17 years old. I do not take that for granted, not for one single day. I know exactly what it cost to get here, and I know exactly whose name should have been the only one on that signature line the entire time. Here is the truth this whole story is actually about, and I want to say it plainly, the way I wish someone had said it to me at 17, sitting in a hospital waiting room learning insurance codes. I should never have had to learn that young. Being underestimated is not always a wound. Sometimes it is a window. The people who dismiss you as too young, too soft, too grief-heavy, too distracted by loss to notice what is happening around you. They are, almost without exception, the same people who never once imagine you might be quietly, carefully paying attention the entire time. I did not win because I was clever, though I did learn to be careful. I did not win because I wanted revenge, though I will not pretend some part of me did not enjoy watching the truth finally land where it belonged. I won because I refused to let someone else's timeline decide when I was allowed to know the truth about my own life. That is available to you too, whatever your version of this looks like. It rarely announces itself as bravery in the moment. Mostly it just feels like sitting very still, holding your breath, and choosing to keep paying attention one more day than anyone expected you to. I want to speak directly to a few of you watching this, because I know some of this landed somewhere specific. If you are 20, or 25 or 30, and someone in your family still talks about you like you are the child you were 10 years ago, the one who couldn't understand adult problems, the one who needs to be managed instead of consulted, please hear me. You are allowed to gather your own evidence. You are allowed to build your own case, quietly, in your own time, before you say a single word out loud. If you are a parent watching this and thinking about a new spouse who has started referring to your child's belongings, your child's money, your child's future, as ours a little too quickly, please pull the paperwork. Read every line item, not just the totals. You are not being paranoid. You are being a parent. If you are an adult child watching a parent be quietly taken advantage of, and you feel powerless because it is not technically your money, your house, your marriage, please hear me. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to request records. You are allowed to care loudly enough that someone eventually has to answer you honestly, even if the person you are protecting is 50 years older than you and technically the one who is supposed to be doing the protecting. If you are the person who carries all the family finances alone, who reads every line item because you learned the hard way that nobody else will, I see you, and I want you to know that vigilance is not the same thing as distrust. You are allowed to love people and still keep good records. Those two things are not in conflict. In my experience, they are the same skill, practiced by someone who has already learned once what it costs to look away. And if you are the person in the story who has been carrying it alone, holding your breath the way I held mine for 4 months, I want you to know that you loved correctly. Whoever hurt you acted incorrectly. Those are two completely different things, and only one of them is your responsibility to carry. One practical thing before I go, because I want this to be useful to you and not just a story. If you have ever signed a document, a loan, a refinance, an account transfer, anything financial, and something about the timeline felt slightly off, slightly too fast, slightly too convenient, you are allowed to request the notarization log from the notary's office. It is a public record in most states. It took me one phone call and a small fee to get mine. If the log does not match your actual whereabouts at that exact hour, you already have your answer. Is there a room in your life right now, a filing cabinet, a folder, an account, where you have been letting someone else write the story of what belongs to you? And if there is, how much longer, exactly, are you planning to let them hold the pen? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Maya was right to wait 4 months and build her case quietly before saying anything. Drop a 2 if you think Diane deserves at least a little bit of sympathy for how scared she must have been about money in the house. Drop a 3 if the story touched something real in your own life, a step-parent, a sibling, anyone who ever treated you like you were too young or too soft to notice what was really happening. Tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is there right now. Someone out there is going to watch this at 2 in the morning from somewhere I would never expect, and somehow this will be exactly the story they needed tonight. That means something to me every single time I read these comments, and I do read every one of them. If any part of the story is speaking to something happening in your own life right now, you are not alone, and I hope you'll stick around. This channel is for people who have carried something heavy quietly for longer than they should have had to. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Columbus, Ohio to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in the story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, your local adult protective services, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet sound you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.